Ani Boujou, because we wanted to do the Kash, Pawating the Dojba, because he don't want to not be able to do it. Tyler LaPlante, I'm the Unified Director, Vice Chairman of the Sioux Tribe. I want to thank everybody who's able to attend in person and online, and I want to give a special thanks to our special guest, Jim Paquette. Let's give him a round of applause here. Jim agreed to do this, not only in Marquette, but to come back here, share his knowledge here, because this is part of his story, and he'll get to that towards the end of the story, and to share with everybody in the Sioux Tribe online as well. So this is the first time we've ever done anything like this, so hopefully it goes smooth. At least we're starting roughly on time right now, so we got a good start going. But let me read you a little bit of an introduction about Jim and his background, so you get a kind of an oversight of what we're going to be talking about today. So James Robert Paquette is a true native son of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. He is a direct descendant of the Nodish Anishinaabe French Métis Rivière, St. Joseph, Michilimackinac, et L'Abbé, early fur trading families of Owasawak, a Rému, Lachevaux Marco.
L'Archevêque and Marco.
L'Archevêque and Marco. You put all these French words in here, mixed up so good.
Everybody comes in, like, puts those in there.
Proud and ever conscious of his traditional mixed heritage family, upbringing, and lifestyle, Paquette is an enrolled status member and cultural advisor of the Voyageur Métis Muskrat community. He is a Métis elder and regional educator. Widely recognized today as being one of the prominent authorities on Upper Great Lakes archaeology, Paquette has been conducting a personal spirit quest, an ongoing archaeological field survey since 1984 to locate, document, preserve, and most importantly, to learn from early First Nation cultural sites in the central Upper Peninsula. His unrelenting quest to uncover the missing knowledge of his ancestors' ancient past has led him to make numerous significant archaeological finds in the highlands of Marquette County, most notably being the landmark discovery of the earliest evidence of human occupation in the UP that provided us all with the knowledge that Paleo-Indian families were already living in the northernmost region of Michigan near the end of the last ice age some 12,000 years ago. Paquette has more recently discovered and professionally excavated the prehistoric, or the proto-historic period, circa 1630 Goose Lake Outlet number 3 site in Anishinaabe winter hunting camp, where very early French gift trade items were uncovered, including the oldest assemblage of European glass trade beads ever found in the state of Michigan. And that's what he'll be talking about here tonight. As a certified native paraprofessional archaeologist, Paquette serves his native ancestors as an ardent protector of their ancient sites and as a caretaker of the cultural artifacts, the gifts that they left for us as messages to learn about their lives. As such, Paquette has always been an outspoken advocate for First Nation and Métis cultural resource recognition, respect, and preservation within the state of Michigan. Above all else, Paquette's greatest passion in life is his love for his family, within which he and his wife Karen continue to maintain traditional Upper Peninsula family values and a Great Lakes Métis lifestyle so that their children and their grandchildren will truly understand the vast importance of respecting, honoring, and enjoying the sacred land that is beneath our feet, for it is made up of the very dust of our ancestors. So please join me in welcoming Jim Paquette. You good?
Good. Bonjour. I'm so glad to be here today. It was a little rainy on the way here, and it was, but she's cleared up pretty good right now. What we're going to be talking about tonight is something that's it's an archaeological site, a cultural site that has become one of the most important sites in the entire state of Michigan, and certainly one within the upper Midwest. And so I'm going to get right into it and talk about. It's a very, very small little site, but it's what it holds, the knowledge that it shared with us, that is just so incredible. And my title of the thing is called Gifts from Our Past. I talk tonight, uncovering the story of the people, who want to live at this particular site. Let's see if I can get these right. There we go. Now, the Goose Lake Outlet number 3 site, and I'll give you a little bit of background as to where this site is. In that 20 MQ140, that's just the state designated cultural site number. But it's an early northern Anishinaabe winter hunting encampment site. And what makes it really remarkable is that we've been able to date it, and it goes back to sometime during the 1620s and the 1630s, okay? Nothing like this has ever been found before, okay? And if you want to know exactly where it is from where we are today, you can see where Munising is here. It's just a straight shot west here, and it's right on the edge of Marquette County. It's just 7 miles inland from Lake Superior, okay? It's just inland from Lake Superior, from Marquette Bay, from the Carp River, Chocolate River area. We'll talk a little bit about that. And again, it's the earliest archaeological evidence in the entire Great Lakes region of an ancestral Ojibwa occupation, okay? And we're going to get into what we found here, of course. Now, the story of the discovery, there's actually a long story. We could be here for the next 8 days, and I could be talking about the story behind what led to this discovery. But just to shorten it up, so you're only here for 4 hours tonight. No, the story of the discovery of this site actually began in the summer of 1988. And at that time, I was employed by Northern Michigan University part-time, because I had a full-time job. But I was a lab assistant for Dr. Marla Buckmaster at Northern. And we were working on an archaeological project at a site that was located on Goose Lake, and that's just east of Nagani. And part of my job was to try to figure out, from a historical standpoint, some of the features that we found there. There was things that were like 10,000 years old, but there was also some more recent type historic features. And we're going to try to figure out what those features represented. In other words, they were like the remains of old buildings, but just the earthen foundations and so on. And so I began doing research as to what was there at that spot back in time from historical documents. And one of the things that was a godsend was called the trig maps, the historical maps. And some of you may have heard of them, but maybe not. But at the time, I studied a trig map, and it showed information that was recorded by William Austin Bird, Douglas Houghton during their survey mapping of the Central Upper Peninsula back in the 1840s. Okay. Now, the trig historical maps are based on these guys, their original land surveyors' plat maps and field notes. They show information from pre-settlement times, and there's a reason for that. I'll talk about it. The maps show the nature of the land as it was when it was first surveyed for the United States. Okay. Now, the Trigg historical maps, and this is important, it was developed by a person named J. William Trigg, Bill Sr. And at the time, he was working with attorneys that represented numerous, or several Native American tribes here from Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Iowa. And it had to do with treaty rights and trying to square things up. From 1956 until his death in 1981, and I'll read this, Trigg prepared historical appraisals to establish values of the tribe's lands at the time that the lands were ceded to the United States. In other words, they were getting ripped off, and he was going to try to square that up. The values were used in the tribe's claims to obtain adjustments, and the adjustments that came partly as a result of the work that this man did. Now, as luck would have it, those same maps also led to this discovery. Because one of the things that was on the Trigg maps, when he went back in time, he went back to the 1840s and tried to figure out, okay, what was here based on those notes. One of the things that the surveyors noted was what they wrote in there. They called it an Indian trail from the Chocolate River to the Escanaba River. Okay, and what that was it was a trail, an overland trail that went from the Chocolate River and from the Carp River. It went inland to Goose Lake, to the Goose Lake Outlet. And back then they called the Goose Lake Outlet. That was one of the branches of the Escanaba River, okay? So that's how they wrote it. And Trigg put it on there, on that map, and I saw that on the map, and I thought, well, that's really interesting. Because I'm real familiar with that area. I fished in that area, hunted, I trapped in that area. And so I thought, well, I'm gonna walk down, I'm gonna figure out where Trigg showed that trail, and where the surveyor showed the trail hitting the outlet. And I was able to go there, and it was this beautiful spot. I went there, and there was like nothing there. It had been totally undisturbed forever. And this is what I saw. It was just a spot, and I knew right away that, okay, this is a sweet spot. This is where you would camp. This is a spot where you would come with your families, in years past. And so I told Buckmaster at the time, I said, you got to make note of this spot. We got to go there. We got to try to, at some point in time, we got to watch this spot. Make sure there's no disturbances there. But at some point, we got to do some work there because I know there's something there. And well, what happened was, in 1992, they decided to log in there, in that area. And when they went in, of course, with their logging equipment, they came in, they pushed everything up, they built logging roads, they built log landings, really wiped out some areas of the site. And a good friend of mine named Randy Champion, he was out, happened to be in that area. He got a hold of me right away because he knew how important this was to me. And he said, Jim, they're out there, they're logging right now. He said, they got everything ripped up. And so me and Randy, immediately we took off to that site right away. And sure enough, wherever they were pushing up the dirt, they were pushing up cultural artifacts. And these are just some of the things, like, you know, these projectile points, arrowheads, copper artifacts, and a lot of animals. There was moose teeth, fragments of bigger animal bones and smaller pieces and so on. And plus there were several hearths, you know, fire pits that had been exposed. So, and where we found that, the concentration of material was exactly where the Burt and Houghton mapped that Indian trail from the Chocolate River to the Escanaba River. So we knew we were on a spot that there was definitely going to be something there. Of course, what I did, as I always do, you know, whenever I find anything, it's all fully documented. What I did here was I did this is the official cultural site documentation. I sent all information down to Lansing, so it's documented. So the state of Michigan knows exactly where one of our cultural sites are located. And at that time, we didn't quite know what it was. We just knew that there was a site there. And based upon the artifacts that we had located on the surface, because we were just surface collecting, these were, what you see there are artifacts that would have belonged to what they called during the woodland period. Those were projectile points and scrapers. Those were around 2,000 years old, okay? So when I documented the site, I documented it exactly as what we had found. And so we continued to go to visit the site. We didn't do any type of archaeological work there, digging or anything, but we just continued to visit the site, to walk the areas, but it grew up, like it always does, you know. And so, we didn't do any work there, but on this night right here, this is right after supper time, it was on May 22nd, 1996. And it was just a beautiful evening. It was just a spring evening, and I just had to get out into the woods. And I decided that I was going to take a walk from Goose Lake, go down along the Elvet, and cut across to where I knew this site was, just for the heck of it. But this time when I went, I carried a metal detector, just to scan the subsurfaces to see if there was anything under the surfaces. And I got to tell you, it was I didn't find a whole lot. I found a couple old pennies that were back in the area, stuff like that. But it was a little bit disappointing. But I didn't really care. I was out for the walk. But when I got way to the far end, when I got down to this particular area, and I walked down that road, this two-road road, which was a logging road a few years ago, and it was really opened up. Now it's growing in that photo. I saw what you see right there when I got my fingers on, and that right there is that's the #1 way that I define. That I find archaeological cultural sites. As fire-cracked rock, it's a hearth. And it's very, very distinctive, and once somebody shows you what it is, you would recognize it yourself. In fact, you just got to go probably look in your backyard and check out what a fire pit looks like. And of course, there's thousands of these out there. And of course, when I saw that, because it's in an area that had been pushed up by the plow from the logging equipment had pushed this up and had disturbed the area, so it exposed that. So I walked over to it and I thought, wow, you know, because I was going to turn around. I thought, I'm not finding anything anyway. So at that point, I decided to turn around. And what I did was I scanned right next to it, and I got a reading on my metal detector. And the readings, digital readouts, everything were telling me that it was a brass shell casing. Okay, and believe me, there's millions of brass shell casings out there. And so you get that reading all the time when you're walking through the woods, and you dig about 1,000 of them, and then you quit digging them because you know what it's going to be. Well, that's what this reading told me it was a brass shell casing, and I was thinking, oh. But I hadn't found anything because it was kind of a boring night, so I knelt down and I dug a little divot, and I popped up that divot, expecting there to be an empty brass shell casing. This thing pops up. And when I first looked at it, I'm looking at it probably the same way you are, you're looking at it going, what is this? And I looked at it for a while, and I thought, well, it's a ring. And it's got Chinese writing on there or something like that. So I remember thinking that. And I scrubbed it off a little bit, and I looked, and I thought, oh my gosh, that's IHS with a cross coming off the H. And I'm thinking, it's the Christian Catholic name, abbreviated name for Jesus. And I knew right away what I had found as an archaeologist. I had never had one in my hand before, and I'd only seen them in books. It's what is called a Jesuit ring. Today we call them French iconographic rings, but this was called a Jesuit ring back at that time. And I recognized that, and these are the type of rings, this is a very, very early historic artifact. And scholars, they associate them with 17th century Jesuit missionaries here in North America, here in the upper Great Lakes, as they, in their attempts to Christianize native populations. But the rings were also used as gifts, and gift exchange from the early French traders and explorers. And they show up on sites that are very, very old. Well, guess what? You could have heard me holler all the way to Nagani because I was so excited when I found it. I went, yeah! Oh my God, I couldn't believe what I found. Because I never thought I'd ever see one. And you always think it's just a singular find, that there's nothing else there. And so I just started walking back towards the road, but I was swinging the coil. And when I got closer to the road, which was only like 20 feet away, I got another reading. Reading says, brass shell casings. I'm going, oh, come on. And so I knelt down, took out again a small divot, and up popped some pieces of moose bone. And intertwined with the moose bone were 3 of those rings. And there was 4 of them that were laying there. 2 had the IHS mark on there, which was short for Jesus, which is Jesus in Greek. One of them is called an L heart ring. And that particular type of ring that motif on a ring was popular in France back in the 1600s. And it's basically a valentine. It's a valentine heart. It means, with the L under this, it means my heart is yours. And the other one is just a smaller version of that, a really crude one. These are hand engraved by artisans back in France. Okay, these are little bezels. They're trying to carve those in there. They did a kind of poor job on that one, but they did a good one on the other ones. But those were typical of what the French were when they came here to the upper Great Lakes in particular. Of course, there was this movement among the French government to Christianize. But in reality, a lot of the French that came here, particularly once they came here to the Great Lakes, they came here to be your friend. They wanted to trade, but they wanted to be your friend. And so what you see there, that means my heart is yours. It's a friendship ring. Is exactly what that is. Okay. So anyway, again, sent this new information. I was jumping up and down for joy, so I sent the information down to the office of the state archaeologist. And I said, they're never going to believe this because nobody had ever found anything like that in the Upper Peninsula. They found rings on the eastern end of the UP that are called Jesuit rings, but they don't date to this old. You've seen them at Fort Michilimackinac, and you've seen them at St. Ignace and stuff like that over in that area. And they're there by the hundreds, but they're they're 18th century rings, not early 17th century rings, okay? In fact, these here, I'll explain you something about them. But anyway, the discovery, I had to keep my mouth shut as to where I found them, obviously, because you've got to protect the sites. But I wanted the information to go out that, oh my gosh, look at this, look what we found right here in Marquette County, right in the central UP. And so I went to the newspapers, and of course, they call it unburied treasure, stuff like that. And so there was a lot of publicity and a lot of hype about the fact that those rings were found here. Now, from an archaeological standpoint, and I'll say that from a cultural standpoint, the rings only asked questions. They didn't give us really any answers. And the questions that were in my mind was how in the world did these early French trinkets get to this site here in Marquette County in the first place? Where did they come from? Who did they belong to? Why were 4 mid-17th century rings left at this site? Why did these are perfect shape. They're beautiful, just like someone just dropped them. Were they simply lost, or did something tragic happen to the people who once lived there? And of course, the question that an archaeologist always asks is, how exactly old are these rings? You're always trying to figure out how old something is. It's always the real fun part about being an archaeologist. Well, anyway, I was able to interest Marla Buckmaster up at Northern, and of course, my good friend Randy Champion. We went back to the site in 1999, and we were there in 2000, and we decided, well, there's only one way to find out what's there, and that's actually to put a hole in the ground, to actually just put a test unit in. And it's called a phase 2 test excavation, and that's all you're doing is just going to open up a test unit and just see what's there, to screen it, and just to try to determine if there's anything else there. And so that's what we did. We put in one small unit in 1999 and another one in 2000. And you can see, this is a map here that shows the full end of all of the areas that we excavated on this site, okay? Those little squares are 1 meter by 2 meters, so they're all pretty, this is a really small site. And in 1999, 2000, we put in 2 of them right on the edge of the road. And actually, one of them was right up over the area where I found the 3 rings, okay, because we had marked it. And so we took out those test units. Well, what did we find? Well, we immediately found animal bone, and there was a lot of it. And it was just under the surface. It was just, as soon as you take out, in fact, it was in the sod, in that sod layer, in the roots, it was filled with bone, and then just under that. And of course, from what we could tell, most of it was moose bone. There was an entire joint off of a leg off of a moose, which you can see that we uncovered, and there was multiple moose teeth were found there. On one of the pieces of moose bone, there was, what you can see here is this cut right here, and that's a high impact. Boom! Someone hit that bone and smashed it. And the only way that you're going to get that mark is if you had a trade axe, if you had an iron axe. And you could see where someone smacked that. So that told us, that little piece of bone with that mark gave us information. Some of the other early trade items that we found just the very tip of a very, very old iron butcher knife. And again, a knife and a hatchet or an axe were two of the primary trade items that came into the Great Lakes. That's, people wanted those, okay? And so there was just the very tip where someone had broke the tip off and it was left there. And then there's a really unique thing that we found there. It was a pair of iron scissors that had been left there. And when I went back and I researched what were popular trade items for Native peoples, from the French, one of the most popular things was scissors. And you don't even think of that. And that's because the most popular item in the trade was cloth and needles. And so, of course, that stuff isn't preserved now. You only see the metal items when archaeologists, when they excavate something, you don't see the cloth, the clothes and stuff. But we found a pair of scissors. And people have asked me, well, how could they lose a pair of scissors? How could you, something that's so valuable? And I said, I know exactly why. Same reason they lost their rings. They had kids. That's a joke. Any of you had kids know it, that's the truth. So anyway, but anyway, copper and brass, there was copper and brass kettle fragments. One of the most popular trade items was the copper and was the metal kettles. They're made out of copper and brass. But these kettles, they were used for cooking, but they just weren't used for cooking because they were just beautiful, shiny metal. And so the people that here in the Great Lakes, and Anishinaabe Ojibwa people, one of the things they did with these brass kettles was they cut them into pieces. They made jewelry from them. They made knives out of them. They made little trinkets, the jingle that are on your clothes that were tied to clothes. So there were a lot of things that they did, and sure enough, we found a piece of a copper pot and a piece of a brass pot, which is just a small pieces, exactly what you would expect to find on a site. And then we found something beautiful. We found a single, it was an oval robin's egg blue French glass trade bead. Just one of them. Just this beautiful little bead that you can see there, that's sky blue. And that was it. But we knew that we had discovered something extremely rare. It was an inland indigenous hunting and encampment site, and based upon the artifacts that we were finding, it probably dated to sometime in the 17th century, maybe even back into the 1600s, and that's what we were thinking at that time. But everybody's telling us, no way that you got a site that old. We're thinking, well, we'll have to do some more work here to try to figure out how old it is. But we knew this, that whoever was living there, just inland from Lake Superior, just up the shoreline up here, whoever it was, they had made contact, either direct contact with the very earliest of these French people who were here trading, or they also, and it could have been face to face, but it also could have been down the line trade, because there was trade networks that were already set up between, Native peoples that lived to the east of us with people here and people all over the place. So things were just traveling. Trade goods were traveling fast. But the possibility of there being early French people face-to-face contact was something that was like, these people were here like before the Mayflower landed over at Plymouth Rock, and it was pretty interesting. Well, anyway, when we found that stuff, that wasn't my expertise at all in archaeology and in Great Lakes archaeology. So what I had to do is I had to educate myself. I had to, about this time period, the 17th, all of my studies in the past had been with the very first people that lived here. For example, the books that you have here, that documents one of the most important archaeological discoveries ever made in the Great Lakes, and certainly here in Michigan, because it documents the first proof that we have been here since the end of the last ice age, that people have been living here since forever, basically. And previous to that discovery, the archaeologists said, no way, people didn't live here during Paleo-Indian times because it was too cold. That's what I was told. I said, too cold. They lived in Canada, in Wisconsin, Minnesota. They lived here, and they did, and we were able to define it. But anyway, that's where my expertise was in what they call Paleo-Indian archaeology. But I wanted to know more, but I also, at this point in time, understanding that it was a French probable at the time, we didn't know if it was Anishinaabe, we didn't know what it was, but we just knew that it was a native site. But I really just raised my own interest in myself as a human being, as a Métis, as a what we call a French Indian. That's my great grandpa, my grandpa, and my dad, and of course that's me sitting there with that deer. But what my grandpa always talked about was he did refer to himself as he referred to himself as Chippewa French or as French Indian. Okay. And but he never called himself, he never referred to himself as being. Today we call him Métis. I know he said Métis because that's it's spelled with an S. When I pronounce it in French, it's Métis. You don't pronounce the S. But anyway, so I wanted to know more about me, and I thought whoever was at this site you had the French connection and you had the Anishinaabe connection, and that was me. And so I thought, I really dug into it. And like I said, I wanted to know more about who I am as a direct descendant of early French voyageurs, trader men who came right here and married Great Lakes Anishinaabe women. And that's who I am, and that's who we all are. Not all are, but that's who a lot of us are. And so that really became a big thing for me. And what I did was, in order to do that, it wasn't going to be archaeology, it was going to have to be genealogy. And so I just got really hooked into genealogy, and lo and behold, it just took a lot of work. This was as much work as I ever undertook. But I was able to go back and study primary records, proof from actual baptismal records, from marriage records, and from death records, and from actual records that were being kept, particularly by the French in particular. And I was able to identify several of my ancestors, French ancestors, who came here to the Upper Great Lakes and to the Upper Peninsula area, and they came here in the 1600s and early 1700s. They never left. They stayed here, and they became one with the people that were here. A good example is the names that you were struggling with there is Jean-Baptiste Réaume. He was with. He married a woman probably somewhere, we don't know exactly where, but we think it was somewhere near St. Ignace, because that's where Réaume was at the time. Her baptismal name, she was baptized a Catholic, because her first name was documented as Symphoros, which is after St. Symphoros. But her name down at Fort St. Joseph, her name was written down by the French as Wawa Boukwe. And at Fort Michilimackinac, at Mackinac, was written down as Wawa Boukwe. Okay, and so, but I was able to trace my ancestry right back directly to these people. And now here's a weird thing, and this is a little bit off the subject of where we're going with the archaeology, but here was a weird thing, was that my grandpa Paquette always said that, he says, I'm Chippewa French. He says, but we're also other Indian. And he says, we're two kinds of Indian. And I said, well, what's the other one, Grandpa? And he says, Iroquois. Now, anybody who knows the history behind, if you go back in the distant past and you know the history of Ojibwa, Anishinaabe people, and Iroquois people, it wasn't very good. And there's actually an Ojibwa word for it that describes this past history. That word is shit show. Okay? You can laugh, because that's what it was. And so I thought, well, my grandpa would tell the truth. So if he said we were part Ojibwa and part Iroquois, I had to go back in time, and I was actually able to find it. It took a lot of work to do it, but I had to go back up into Canada, into the Canadian records and that. And sure enough, there was a record of a woman who, her name was Marianne Sauvagesse. That's how it was recorded. And Sauvagesse is a French word for it. Basically means a wild woman, but not in a derogatory sense, but it means a native woman is what it means. And she had a daughter who was, an Iroquois daughter whose name was Marie-Louise Sauvagesse, and they had a child who was named Marie-Anne St. Ange. And Marie-Louise had this daughter with a French voyageur who, if you're in Detroit, if you understand the history of the Detroit area, you'd recognize this name. His name is Jean-Baptiste Degnaud, which was one of the prominent families down in the Detroit area during when Cadillac went there in 1700. And but anyway, she was born at the trading center in the fur trade settlement Lachine on Montreal Island. And so one of the great things about this particular site, the archaeological part of it, was so important to me. But knowing how much it meant to me from a personal standpoint and how much it meant to my family, because what was there at that site, I understood at that my roots were there. My roots ran deep into that ground where the site was located because of what was found there and the date of it. And of course, it's as a result of doing this detailed documentation that I'm a member of the Métis status in Canada, because there's no Métis status in the United States. But in Ontario, Canada, I'm a member of the Voyageur Métis community, and the people that belong to there are a lot of people from the Upper Great Lakes, like myself, who are non-tribal members, but who can trace our ancestry back to being Anishinaabe. Anyway, but the thing I also decided to do, that was on a personal level, but I decided on a public level I needed to start educating the public about this site. It's something that I always did. You never find anything that you need to share it, because what you find does not belong to you, it belongs to us. That not only includes the objects that you find, but it really includes the knowledge that you find. And you have to share it. If you don't do that, then don't do it. Don't even mess around with the things I do. One of the things I did was I had this incredible archaeologist. Her name was Dr. Carol Mason. She just passed away this past winter. And she lived out in Wisconsin, and she was just this incredibly smart human being. And she's the first person to ever really figure out what these Jesuit rings were, iconographic rings, because previous to her, there was other archaeologists that tried figuring it out, and they got it all wrong. Carol figured it out, and she asked me if I would be interested in co-authoring a paper with her for the Wisconsin Archaeologist regarding the rings that were found there, because she understood how important that was to our Great Lakes archaeology, to our Great Lakes history, that these rings were found there. And what we found out was, and I'm going to give her all the credit. I don't use the word we, but it wasn't we, it was she. And I was her co-author, but she was the one she was the brains behind the whole thing. But this style of engraving, and this was a shock to me, this style of engraving, it belongs at the earliest part of the ring sequence and represents the earliest known rings to ever come into New France from Europe. Those hand engraved plaques with the ridge bands, those are the earliest of the rings. They're not like the rings at Fort Michilimackinac that date to the 1740s. These rings date back to the 1620s into around 1660. Okay, these are the ones that you can see right there. Like I said, those rings are extremely old. So that changes everything in how we're approaching this site, because this pushes this site from being what we would call a historic site to what we call the proto-historic period. And that proto-historic period is like this cloudy time period that archaeologists and scholars and historians, really sort of dabble into, but they're not quite sure what's going on there. And I'm going to, with Ron Mason, actually that's Carol Mason's husband, he was a great archaeologist as well, and he just passed away. But here's how he described the proto-historic period, okay? It's the time during which the first European artifacts or materials appear in a given region, but before Europeans arrived themselves in any significant numbers and began to record something of their observations, okay? And so here in Michigan, here in Western Great Lakes, and here in the Upper Peninsula, that is that time period, that proto-historic time period when Europeans are showing up on the East Coast and things are sort of moving this way, but not a whole lot. That time period is from the very early 1600s until the mid-1600s. And after the mid-1600s, which you'll see here in the Upper Peninsula, you'll see the missionaries start to come, you'll see more and more trade occurring, and you're going to see people coming here, and actual people recording what they're seeing, okay? This dates prior to that. This dates to the proto-historic period. Well, like always, I'm left out there holding the bag because from the fall of 2000 to 2012, nothing else happened at this site. I tried to generate interest with professional archaeologists to come out to this site and to excavate. And there was people that said, oh yeah, this is really great, but they never did it. And so it was really extremely frustrating for me to sit there all the years and just watch things grow up, and watch the roads, people go in there, with dirt bikes and such. And that's exactly what happened. In 2012, what they did was, it was called the Loose Moose Enduro, and it actually started the year before, and it was dirt bikes. And the dirt bike trails went right through the site. I mean, right through the areas that needed to be protected. And so I approached Cleveland Cliffs Iron Company, who was the owner of this property, and they said, well, we're not going to stop them bikes from going in there, because they have just as much right to be there as anybody. So what I did was I thought, okay, that's it. It's time to do something. And I'm not going to wait for any other professional archaeologists to step up. I knew I could do it because at that time I was I still am a certified native paraprofessional archaeologist from the Keweenaw Indian community. And at the time I was also a cultural resource specialist for KBIC. And I thought, I don't need them, I'm going in. But I did approach two archaeologists and if you want to back up in it, what I did, this is just a couple of quick things, I don't even have to stay here too much, but with KBIC, I worked with their Tribal Historic Preservation officer in their offices, Summer Sky Cohen, some of you might remember her. And I happened to be the person who, I did the study on the Eagle Rock, and everybody may remember the battle that we had with both the government and with the mining companies at Eagle Rock. Well, that's one of the projects that I worked with KBIC on, and I'm the person who, I did this the preliminary surface culture resource survey assessment with Summer Cohen and a couple other of the tribal members. And also, one of the things I'm really proud of is that while I was there, I'm sitting here beating my chest, but I'm just proud of it, that I'm the person who officially documented Eagle Rock as a Michigan Cultural Archaeological Site with the Office of the State Archaeologist and also with our State Historic Preservation Office. And although in the end, we sort of lost that battle, there's still a big fence around that rock. And part of it is because that site is documented as a sacred cultural site. And I was to work on that. The other thing I did was with KBIC and LVD, and with Lockview Desert also, one of the projects that I worked on with them, I worked on numerous projects with them on preservation projects against the state and local governments and so on. But we went after protecting the 11,000-year-old Paquette site. And it's located just really close to where the Goose Lake Outlet site is. It's on Goose Lake, so it's only like a half-mile away. But the DNR was going in there, and they were going to build new roads and a boat landing and everything else, and it was right on this site that had been fully documented. And so I got into a major battle, and I decided that I wasn't going to mess around. I went right to the state governor with my information. I didn't mess around, and it worked. And so we actually won that battle against the state of Michigan. That's me with one of the head of the DNR right there. Anyway, NMU archaeologist John Anderton, Marla Buckmaster agreed to help excavate the site. Great. Two great archaeologists that agreed to help after I said I'm going in by myself. We got the written permit from Cliffs. Whoever's the landowner owns everything, okay? And so you got to get permission if you're going to do anything, but if you're going to do a professional excavation, you have to get a permit from the landowner. Not only to excavate, but also to hang on to whatever you find, okay? And it was an all-volunteer effort. There was no money involved. I didn't have any money, and so what we did was we looked for volunteers, and we had some incredible volunteers. We had as many as you could possibly want. Many of those volunteers came from my family. A lot of them came from Northern Michigan University. A lot of them came from the U.S. Forest Service, the crews that were out here on Grand Island. With Jim Skibo came over and helped out on this particular project. So there was a lot of really great people. Now, the site itself, I want to explain this. There's a roadway that runs right through the middle of, there's a north side of the site, we call it north and south. That roadway is the logging trail, but it's also that Indian trail from the Chocolate River to the Escanaba River. It ran through there, and that roadway ran on that trail, okay? Now, on the north, we excavated on the north side of that roadway and the south side. And you can see here in 2012, again, those are the units that we took out. We see in blue there. That's what we took out then, and then in 2013, you can see that we took out those additional units there. Now, this was great. What happened? On the north side of the road, and there was that road went through and actually obviously destroyed parts of the site. But on the north side of the road, it was your soil was this really compacted, dark, greasy soil, okay, that you can see here. You see the difference right there? or you can see what that looks like. No gravel, no nothing like that, and it was filled with various artifacts, filled with bone, filled with we'll talk about it later, different types of artifacts that were there. And it was really obvious that this was where a dwelling had sat, okay, a few hundred years back. That this is where whatever they were living, the wigwam they were living in, was sat right there. And that's why this was all compacted. There was also part, when we excavated, there was also part of where they had their inside fire pit, where they had a fire inside. You can see that on the ground, but it's not in this photo here. The south side of the road was completely different, because on the north side you had where they were their living structure, but on the south side of the road was their work area. This is where they did their cooking. This is where they processed their hides. They did any number of things over on that side. It was very, very different. It was filled with what we call the fire-cracked rock. It was filled in, the soils were, it wasn't like this compacted, greasy soil, but there was spots where there was like grease, where they must have been dumping pails of moose fat, or the water from boiling moose, moose fat and stuff. So it was really, really different with the features, and so it told you exactly that you had, here's where they were living in the structure, here's where they were doing all their work, which is exactly what you would expect to find. That's not an unexpected thing. If you didn't find that, you'd think you would know what you're at. Well, anyway, one of the things about it was all of the cultural material was very shallow, because it was just, this stuff's only been there for a few hundred years, but there's not a lot of soil development. It's just sitting up a little bit on a knob. And everything's what they call the A horizon. So it's only like maybe the first 10 to 15 centimeters, maybe this much here. Almost everything is laying within that upper layer up there, okay? And you can see some of the photos as we were excavating. And what did we find? Well, we found glass trade beads, and we found a lot of them, okay? During 2012-13, we recovered 45 additional very early, beautiful glass trade beads. Both the blue ones, the dark blue ones, the white ones, and you can see that these tube beads, these red tube beads that were also found there. This one particular, I'm pointing at it right now, this bead that you see right there, that bead there actually is called an heirloom. It's an heirloom bead, because that bead would have been brought to North America back in the 1500s, 1580, and somehow it ended up here. It went through families and trade networks and whatever, and it came from the East Coast when it was dropped off there by the French or by Basque traders, and it ends up here in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. So it tells you about these vast trade networks that are occurring, and plus the movement of people. Animal bone, oh my gosh. We found almost 9,000 pieces of animal bone, all fragments, I might add, and teeth. The bone was Dr. Terry Martin from Illinois State Museum. He's a nationally recognized faunal expert. He identified the remains as being mostly moose, but there was also beaver, exactly what you'd expect to find. Beaver, otter, porcupine, and muskrat, but there was moose was one of the primary animals that they were going after. We found, and again, everything was busted up in pieces, okay? And so a lot of it was cooked, a lot of it wasn't cooked yet. It wasn't boiled, but it was, a lot of it was. We found the stone hammers that they were using to fracture that material. And there was maybe you know or maybe you don't know why we find that very, very typical on these early sites, you find all of this fractured bone. And the reason is because the native peoples that were living here and actually throughout the whole Northeast, all of the Algonquian-speaking peoples, you find these on all of their sites. You find all this fractured moose bone and caribou bone. And there's a good reason for it, because they used every part of that animal to survive, including the bone. And this is something that I found this in one of the early documents, and this was written in 1672. So it's back around the same time period. It was written by a Frenchman who was with the Micmac Indians to the east of us here. And here's what he wrote. He said, they collected all of the bones of the moose, pounded them with rocks upon another larger size, reduced them to a powder. Then they placed them in their kettle and made them boil well. This brought out a grease which rose to the top of the water, and they collected it with a wooden spoon. They kept the bones boiling until they yielded nothing more, and with such success that from the bones of one moose, without counting the marrow, that's not even the marrow, they obtained 5 to 6 pounds of grease as white as snow and firm as wax. It was this they used as their entire provision for living when they went hunting. We call it moose butter. Sounds yummy, eh? That's why you find it stands to reason. So the other thing was, when we looked at the animal bones told us something else. It really told us when people were there, because as we studied, as we know, the northern and southern seasonal movements, that those animals, you hunt those animals and secure them one time during the year, winter time, biboon. And so that's when the native peoples up here went after the moose in their camps. That's when you went after beaver, and that's when you went after things like muskrat. Okay, that's when they hunted these animals, because they had methods. When we think of muskrat trapping and beaver trapping, they weren't trapping those animals like you would today with traps. They basically hunted them in their homes. And so it was the same with the moose. You had to wait till there was enough tough snow depth in order to go after these moose, particularly when you're using the weapons that they were using, because what they were doing was we not only found what they were hunting and butchering and eating, but we also found their arrowheads. These are what's called triangular Madison points. That's what an archaeologist referred to that as that. They're projectile points, but what they are is arrowheads. And they're small little arrowheads, but these arrowheads, this is the type of a point right there. You see that for almost 1,500 years, all of the Anishinaabe people that lived up here in the upper Great Lakes, that's this type of point that they were making, the type that they were using on their shafts. Okay, and we found 4 of those that were located at the site. We also found some small stone flakes, tools. There's some fire flints for striking, for making your fires. Some scrapers, wedges. There's the 2 on the edge are like wedges that they probably maybe pounded into bone to try to split that bone, or to split wood, because they're doing other things there at the same time. And then on this particular day, on August 15, 2012, at 10:42 a.m., someone said, "Oh my gosh, here it is. There's a ring," and we found the 5th ring. And again, it was another IHS ring. And this was found on the south side of the road. The other rings were found on the north side of the road, where the habitation structure was. This was found in the area where they were processing the hides and the meats. Okay. Then we found a piece of metal, kettle metal. Then we found something that you'll never ever find, because these will rust away. Found an eyed sewing needle, which was incredible. And that's because the soil conditions at this particular site, I'm going to talk about a lot, but the reason there was so much bone and so much and everything, even all of the metals just were like someone dropped them yesterday. It had to do with the formation of the soils that were there. And John Anderton, and I might talk about here a little bit later, he was able to figure out why that was. It was just this 1 in a million sweet spot based upon the soil that was sitting at this spot where they camped by chance. And like he said, if they were camped 100 yards that direction or any other direction, all of that bone would have been gone and these things would have rusted away. But they happened to sit where there's all of this silt that was inside this soil that preserved this material. This was a really weird thing to find. That if you go back that old, there was 3 pieces of lead shot, what you call swan shot. There are some people that think, well, maybe someone came there later on, hunters maybe it's double odd buckshot where someone hunted, because there's people that do hunt in that same area. But the unique thing about these, one of these pieces was fired. You can tell by looking at it. It was fired because it's sort of distorted, it's oxidized. 2 of them were just dropped. Someone dropped unfired shot. And both of those unfired shot were found within that structure that was sitting there. And that's telling you that maybe somebody had a gun. Now, the other thing to remember is that when I've researched lead, that one of the trade items, or among all of the trade items, native peoples were trying to get metal objects from the French and from the British and from the Dutch. And a lot of times it was just plain lead, because you could take lead, whether it be bullets, and you could pound them into pieces and you could form them into shapes. You could form them into jewelry. So just because you found that there doesn't necessarily mean you had a gun. However, one of them was fired. Now we're still working on this one as to why, because that's really, really early for anyone to have a gun here in the Great Lakes. And so I'll tell you maybe a little bit more about it later. Now here's something else we found that was weird. And understand how small it is. It looks big there in that picture, but this thing's about like that wide right there. It was a piece of wound black glass. And it was obviously, had to have been an ornament of some sort. And I'm going to come back to that research question marks there, because this thing really had us wondering, what in the world is this? What could that possibly be? Because I've never seen anything like it, and nor did any of the other archaeologists, so we were wondering, okay, what is that? So we were left wondering. Now the other thing, when you're excavating, you're just not looking for artifacts, okay? You're looking for information as to what was there. So you're looking for parts, you're looking for what we call features. You're looking for anything that's in that soil that's going to tell you, give you information as to what was there and what were the people doing while they were there. And so we were able to map these areas, which you'll see here, like you see like this dark area here, like that. Well, that's what we call a pit feature. And as you excavate that out, you can take that right out. It's like a basin-shaped feature that's circular. And there's numerous of these circular basin features that were located on both sides of the road. Some are located right on the edges of where the structure was located, but there was others on the other side of the road as well. What we did was we took from those features we took what they call flotation samples. The material that we took from those features, we were able to they call it flotation. And what they'll do is they put this into there's a process. I'm not going to get into it. It's a fairly complicated process. But you can tell that whatever remnants are left in that feature, you can pick those out. And what we found out was Katie Parker, who lives just south of Mackinac City. She's this incredible botanist and works on archaeological sites and does botany analysis for people all over the United States. She was involved in this project. In fact, she visited the site, and what she was able to find was that what she saw was primarily was wood fragments, tiny wood fragments, and almost all of it was what she saw was deciduous wood, was hardwood, and there was a little bit of pine, but not much. Now, know this: that inside a wigwam, inside of a birch bark or a structure, you're not going to burn. You don't burn pine. It's like you don't burn pine much in your camp. I got a camp with a fire. You burn hardwood because the sparks. There's so many sparks. The heat that comes off of pine, you don't want to use that. And so what we found was that here's what she said. She says wood was recovered in high frequencies from some samples reflecting large fires needed for cold weather occupation and/or major game processing cooking events. So what she found in her sampling was exactly what we expected to find, because we were expecting to find something that was associated with the winter campsite. And she was able to bring it up. Now here's something that's really interesting. This way, you got to keep your eyes really open when you're excavating. Up in here, it doesn't look like anything, right? But when we were excavating, this is on the north side of the road again, where you see that dark, compacted, greasy soil. And when we were in that greasy soil, there was a piece of bark that was in there, a rather large piece of bark. And we were thinking birch bark. That's the first thing that came to our mind. And so what we did was we took it very, very carefully, removed that piece of bark and all of the surrounding soils and took it up, and we brought it back up to the archaeology lab up at Northern. And then we put these little picks, picked away at it just to try to separate the soils from that very, very, from that birch bark or from that bark as you can imagine wanting to fall apart. And we sent the bark down to Katie Parker, and we said, what do you think of this birch bark? And she says, that's not birch bark, that's black ash. It's Papagimak. And anybody who knows anything about the use of black ash among Native people, especially among the Anishinaabe, that's the wood that we would use for basket making for any number of things. And you can split it, you can use it. But also one of the things that it really, which you'll see, if you look at a lot of the the wigwams and the structures that are made, also black ash is used as a siding on structures as well. So it wouldn't be as surprising at all. Then of course over the top of this you probably put birch bark, because the birch bark is more waterproof. But this has an insulating factor to it. And so you'll see that used a lot. So it was just really interesting that we found a big fragment of that black ash that was sitting in there, and we were able to recover it. So it was really exciting for us. Anyway, well, how old is the site? Well, when did people live there? And the question is there, what do the gifts from Biboon tell us? And when you look at just the upper things, you look at the projectile points, those arrowheads, they'll tell us that this site dates to sometime around from about 1000 AD to 1700s, because that's how long they were using that type of thing, that type of arrowhead. The French artifacts, the iron artifacts that you see up there in the brass, those are common, okay? And they start from around 1600s into the 1700s, you'll see those types of artifacts. But it's those rings down there that gave us a specific date initially as to how old that site is, because those rings date from around 1625 to 1660. Now, what about the beads? Well, I'm going to read this. It says, because bead assemblages change frequently, no other artifact can be more valuable than glass beads as a chronological indicator. In other words, beads changed in manufacturers, changed in styles, changed in what people wanted, just like things do today, okay? And think back to, if you're thinking of an assemblage, and when I say an assemblage, like a bead assemblage, which is all the beads combined, look at kitchens. And any one of these, if you go back to the 1880s and go into the early 1800s up until 1980s, what you see in those pictures is the assemblage of things that are in a kitchen at that period in time. Everything there is considered part of that assemblage, the stove, the dishes, the tables, everything else. But through time, it always changes. We always, there's a few things that we might keep. You might have a kitchen from 1880 and in 1920, you still got maybe a few things hanging around. But for the most part, things will change. Whether it be, and that's the same with cars, with the clothes that we're wearing now, they're not the same clothes you wore 30 years ago, not the same styles, and so on and so forth. So the same things occurred with beads. And so, because people have done great studies on these beads to try to date them. And so what does the bead assemblage tell us when they were there? Well, you're another great luck on my part was there's another incredible woman archaeologist, again, extremely smart. Her name is Heather Waller. She's done a lot of great work here in Great Lakes archaeology. But she's a very young woman. She just got her PhD, but she's just a fireball. And she asked me to co-author a paper with her, and we called it Glass Trade Beads from Goose Lake Outlet No. 3 site. And we really put our heads together on this one. We're 50-50 on this one. I'm not going to give her more credit. So we're 50-50 on this one. But anyway, here's what our study. We came up with something that it basically almost shocked us in a way. Because our 2017 study determined that the vast majority of the bead types dated to what they call a glass bead period 2, and that was from 1600 to 1630, and some of them came from the other glass. The rest of them came from the glass bead period that dated from that 1630 to 1650. Every one of these beads were extremely old, and some of them were a lot older than we even thought they were. And so when you look at the assemblage, you just try to figure out, okay, which one. Some of these were what they call heirloom beads. Some are being traded there. Some you may have gotten like 2 weeks ago. Some you got 20 years ago, whatever. So you're trying to try to figure it out. They call it seriation is the process we use. But it dates the site to probably around the 1630s. Okay, now that was big news. The result of this study is the temporal identification of the Goose Lake Outlet glass bead assemblage to circa 1630s, making it one of the oldest, if not the oldest, known assemblage of glass trade beads found within the modern boundaries of Michigan. It is, in fact, the oldest. Okay, when we wrote this, we said, well, if not the oldest, but it actually is the oldest. And then something else happened. I'm not really going to get into a lot of detail on this because it has to do with carbon-14 dating. And this is a little bit out of my league. But we were able to secure samples to do what they call carbon-14 dating, and it was off of moose bone. And they were able to date the moose bone, and I know this looked confusing to you, and it's a little bit confusing to me, but I do understand it. But the moose bone dates right into this time period right here, which is exactly what we thought. It'd be like just right after 1600, the moose bone fragments that we found up until around just prior to 1650. So the moose bone also gives us just 2 pieces of the thousands that we found, give us evidence that that site dates back to that time period. So anyway, there it is. We knew at that point that we had a one-of-a-kind, it was a one-of-a-kind Lake Superior Region winter inland hunting camp that dated back to the time periods 1630s, probably a little bit earlier than that is what we're going to see here. But once again, nobody did a thing on the site. And I said, we've got to go back and finish up because we didn't really finish the excavating yet. There's still a little, let's try to determine exactly the boundaries of this small little campsite. And of course, from 2013 to 2021, as I said, only my hat and my face grew older, you know what I mean, as I waited for something to happen. And I was wearing the same hat. That hat did get a lot older. But anyway, in the spring of 2021, I said, I'm going in. You don't have to come in if you're coming. If anybody wants to join me, go ahead. I got the skills, and I got the excavators, skilled excavators who can come in, and we're going to go do it. And so I grew up plans to go in and excavate. I figured out, and what I wanted to do was, we already knew, we already thought we knew. We knew a lot about what was here based upon what we had. And that's one of the reasons archaeologists said, well, you know, we already got enough information because you know how old it is and stuff. And I said, yeah, but there's more information there. Why don't we go back? Why don't we go back and let's figure out, okay, we know that maybe things site ends here, but let's figure out the boundaries. Let's figure out, and what else lies within this, in these adjacent units here. You know what I mean? And let's finish it up. Because otherwise it's just going to get destroyed. The site's going to be destroyed. And of course, I did get any takers from any professional archaeologists to come in and fully work there. But I'll talk here in a minute. But there were a couple who really did help out, though. But anyway, Chris Osier, I worked through the Marquette Regional History Center. I didn't want to say it was me, Jim Paquette wants to go there and dig. It had to be through a professional organization. And so the Marquette Regional History Center, who actually had helped out a lot and cooperated on the first series of digs. Chris Osier went to Cleveland Cliffs, and she got a permit. And I actually tried getting a permit from Gabe Johnson, who was their landowner, like for a couple of years. I kept sending him emails and talking, and I don't know, we're going to be doing something here. But Chris is this real sweet talker, just a wonderful human being. So I told Chris, I said, Chris, why don't you get a hold of Gabe? You ask him, see what he says. And she says, well, I called this morning. He said, sure, go ahead. So anyway, so thank you, Chris. Otherwise, we probably wouldn't be seeing this. Anyway, here was the problem that we had, though. John Anderton passed away. And John Anderton, like myself, was a Métis. He was a part of Anishinaabe. But he passed away in the winter of 2014 while he was skiing. And the buckmaster, she had retired completely from archaeology. She had some very, very serious health issues. And so there was no other regional professional archaeologists who volunteered to help on the excavation. And I thought, well, I don't need them. We're going in. And so the volunteers were my French Indian Métis Paquette family, and best friend Randy Champion, who's also a Métis, also a part of Anishinaabe, and also my cousin Sue Bellinger, who came there to really help out. These were really experienced excavators, especially the little kids. You wait to see these pictures; they were so good at it. But Dr. Luke Winionek, I can hardly say his name. I already got a hard time saying it. He's actually from Montreal, but he was a professor out and teaching out on the East Coast. But his wife is from Marquette. And so we became good friends through the years. And Luke was one of the people who really pushed time and time again for people to go excavate that particular site. He was really interested in preservation of our cultural sites here on the south shore of Lake Superior. And that's one of the things that, you know, every time he came up to visit me, he would help me on different things. And that was, especially like he understood Paleo-Indian archaeology. He was a Paleo-Indian archaeologist, and so he helped me really learn a lot about things that we found in Marquette County. He comes up to help. He's suffering from stage 4 pancreatic cancer. And I'm thinking, I don't want to say nothing about anybody else, but I can't get a certain archaeologist to come, he's 4 miles away to come down and help out. But he comes all the way from the East Coast with stage 4 cancer to help out. Okay, tells you something about him as a human being. And of course, he's since passed away, but Luke was such a great help. And of course, Terry Martin, he was the archaeologist faunal expert. He came up both of these years. He's going to come up and he's going to spend a whole week out there. And this guy is incredible. Just a phenomenal archaeologist who works on Great Lake archaeological sites, both in Lower Michigan and in Wisconsin and such. But he was a godsend. Just super, super smart, super funny, a lot of fun to be with. Now, here's what you do if you're an archaeologist. So here's what I had to do. Okay, I'm thinking, okay, there are going to be people out there that are going to think, say, so-called professional academic archaeologists are going to be thinking that, well, you know, who's this Paquette guy, you know? And I'm thinking, well, so I knew I got to do it right, but I know how to do it right. I've done it before. And so, but here's what you do is, you document everything. You don't do anything that you don't write down in a book, that you don't take a picture of. Everything is documented, everything is measured. You do square sheets, you do field notes, just to the nth degree. And of course, one thing is you take documentation photos and also movies. I took movies of everything you do. I took hundreds of photos every time you found something, every time you thought you saw something. Even if you weren't finding anything, you took photos of what you were looking at. So you always have this documentation for yourself, for your study, but also for future generations. So when someone else wants to go back and study this, they have all of this documentation where they can just pick it up and go, oh, 20 years from now, you'll see someone will grab this stuff and say, this is all the documentation is there. Everything's there. Anyway, we started taking out the units on the north side of the road. I'll tell you right now, I'll go through this kind of quick here. The units that we took out on the north side of the road were exactly what we kind of expected, but I wanted to be sure. They were mostly sterile. They were largely disturbed by the modern day logging activities. They had pushed through these areas. But we were able to prove that, to show that. And that's what we want. That's what I wanted to do. I knew there wouldn't be much there, but we were going to excavate it anyway, and we were going to prove it. But we did find a few things. This is two of our excavators, two of my grandsons. We found a small amount of animal bone, found another moose tooth, and of course, find fire crack rock. And that fire crack rock was spread out through the whole thing. But on the north side of the road, we were right on the. We did find something really cool. We had carefully crawled out this portion of a basin feature. And when we had excavated back in 2013, we had excavated the other half of that. And we had found two beads right in the very bottom. So I knew that was going to be there. I knew the other half was going to be there. So I couldn't wait to go and crawl out that feature. And sure enough, on the very bottom of it, there was a few pieces of animal bone, and that was about it. But on the very bottom was this tiny little bead that, and it's another very, very early 1600s French glass trade bead. And it's sort of it's got like a yellowish amber color to it. It's a little bit different than the other ones, but it's like a seed bead, very, very tiny. And so that was a great find. But finding little to nothing is a success, because when you find nothing, you've actually found something. You found information. But we determined the east and southeast boundaries of this occupation feature that sat on the north side of the road. The rest of it we were able to map. They took the out parts of it here. We found the features within it, and we know that that's it. And these parts here would have been destroyed by the logging road and by that logging activity and so on and so forth. So we got the major portion of it. So we were happy with that. We moved to the south side of the road. And the south side of the road, I got to tell you what, again, totally different. South side of the road, the north side of the road, where I had this nice greasy soil and stuff. It had some nice, you had grass, you know, some really nice. It was really kind of nice to excavate on that side. When you just moved on the other side of the road to where the outside processing area was, it was trees and poison ivy. Okay, and it was like it's layered on the ground. It's totally different. Like from me to you away, it's that and something else. And it was just, so you're in there and you're going to wear gloves and you're in there going, oh, you know, because it's poison ivy. Like, and after a while, when I first started working here, I wasn't allergic to it. After a while, you do. You get, you know, now if I even see it, like my eyeballs itch. But, so we went across the road and from finding absolutely nothing basically nothing on the north side of the road, on the very first shovelful that we put in, that's Randy popping that thing out of there was a bead. Right off the bat, so everybody's going, yeah, everybody's sure it was this tiny little bead, so we were happy it's not a robin's egg blue bead. The next day, that's my wife Karen and grandson Joshy, who was outstanding eyeballs on a screen and really good at seeing it compared to my old eyeballs. And so on the very first shovelful the next day, two more beautiful early glass trade beads were found, so we were really pumped up. And then Joshy was excavating with Karen, and where we just found the two trade beads, and he comes walking over to me because I told him, anything you see, Joshy, that you don't know what it is, you bring it to me and I'll tell you. We don't throw it on the way. And he says, okay. So he comes walking up to me with this thing, and he says, Grandpa, what is this? And I went, I have no idea what that is. It's like, what is it? But it's a piece of glass. It's curved. It's hollow. And it's obviously a piece of jewelry. It's not a bead, because I went back and I said they didn't make Venetian beads back then. Like now you can buy curved beads. Well, they didn't make curved beads back in the 1600s. And so, but it's a piece of glass, European glass that's been curved. Okay. Now, what do you think that is? What I think it is, and what I think we know it is, it's a piece of jewelry, but it's not a bead, because all Native peoples back then, especially all the Anishinaabe people, were well known for all of the jewelry they were. Men and women both. And of course they had not only just beads under clothes and such, but they all had earrings, and the majority of them, especially at this time men, because you see the early accounts, the men loved piercing their noses, and they had pierced noses. And so this particular piece of glass was it was a piece of jewelry, obviously, that could have been, and you could take your best guess, but it was undoubtedly used as a piece of, it was an ornament, glass ornament that was being used by the people out there. It's extraordinary. No one has ever found any artifact like that on any of the early sites in all of North America. We got one right here. We found one right here. Then there was another glass trade bead, then another. But then there was, what we began to find was on that south side, and no kidding, was hundreds of additional broken pieces of animal bone. Here you can see this is a part of a moose leg fragment. That's a part of a moose scapula fragment. And a lot of the bone was these bigger pieces that were busted up, but a lot of the bone was cooked bone. Okay, it was called calcined bone, and you can see that there's a difference between that kind of bone and this kind of bone, and there was thousands of these little pieces of cooked, boiled bone that were in the soil that was there, that we were picking up. And of course, what we found was just a large quantity, just like we did back when we excavated earlier on the south side of the road, was this large quantity of fire-cracked rock from their cooking hearths and various cooking hearths and stuff. Here's a great photo that we took of one of the hearths that we uncovered. And you can see that they had various ways of cooking, or of drying hides and different things. But this particular hearth here was where they had just laid a pavement of stone, and of course it was down a little bit deeper, so they would have had a fire up on top of it and stuff like that. But they used the heat from the rock was pivotal to what they would do as far as cooking, but also as far as heating back where the structure was. There was a lot of just larger rocks that were brought in there that were obviously pieces of stone that had been heated and then carried inside so that it was like that. But here, this is a great picture of an intact feature. But when you get right to here, right on the edge of it, you can see there was a plow marks right here. That plow just missed that hearth. Okay, but we were able to document that beautiful intact hearth right there. We found some of the scraping tools, and again, you can see the flakes on the edge here. This is like a big flake. This is exactly what you would use to scrape hides and such. And plus, we found dozens of these tiny little micro flakes that came off of these stone scraping tools that were in that same little area there that had busted off of there. Here you can see right there, it says 41 small resharpening flakes. A lot of these would have been popping off as they were doing that, but also if you're using stone, it's gonna dull on you. You just go pop, 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 pop. You take the edges off. You can pop those. You can put that sharp edge right back on there by taking off these tiny little flakes there, and that's what they were doing there. But there was obvious site disturbances. We were able to figure out that over in this area, this was intact, but when you went just right to there, boom, push berms. You can see where they had logged. They had gone in there with a skidder and had, and if there was anything there, it had been pushed away. But I think we put an X. Our X was right on the treasure spot, and we got most of it. So in 2021, back then we accomplished what we wanted to do. We had taken out this unit here. We figured we knew we didn't think anything was here. Sure enough, there really wasn't. So that we were done there. Down here, we took out this side here to get the eastern side, and we were able to do that because we found out that on this edge here it was disturbed, but it was all intact in here. So we accomplished that. Okay, so we accomplished the mission, and I was really happy with it. Now the excavation plan, we had 1 more year to go back. And it was to finalize the mapping of that south outdoor occupation area. And again, I'm going to show you this because this is a really good photograph here. Again, remember I said there's the south side of the road and the north side of the road, the roadway. But we had excavated this area over here, but there was still this section in here which sat right directly adjacent to this roadway that we weren't sure if that was disturbed or not. But we did know that this road, by the looks of the old road, that it actually went through there. But there's only one way to find out, and that was to excavate it, even though you knew that you're probably going to find that it was, but that's going to give you the proof. And again, I had the greatest all-volunteer family team of very experienced excavators that knew exactly what they were doing, and plus they were doing it from their heart. It wasn't, they weren't there, nobody was paying them, they were there because they believed in what they were doing, and so they were just totally dedicated to putting up with the poison ivy, the bugs and the heat, and let's just get it done. And so we started excavating close to the road, and you can see these are just excavation photos that I was taking. But you see, it looks, out of my notes, it says mostly sterile, looks to be disturbed, very little. We were in the old roadway, obvious disturbed, bush area, so you document all of that with your photos and your notes. And so what we were able to determine was on that area there that was closest to the road, that the area was it had been disturbed. So because it was disturbed here, we were able to find out that this is the north boundary of the undisturbed area. But as luck would have it, when we were taking out screening that material from the disturbed areas, Karen comes up with two of the best finds there that we came up with. On August 10th, she recovered out of the disturbed context, because we're still very carefully looking at see if anything's there. She found these two incredible beads. One is just a white little tube bead, and the other one is a navy blue circular bead, or a round bead. Both of those beads date to around 1600 to 1620. Very, very old beads. And she found them in the same little spot when she pulled them out of there. So that's why she's smiling there. Well, I thought I had expected to do some more excavating up into this area here, but we had already hit the edge of the road, the disturbed area, so we were kind of done. And I thought, well, Terry Martin was coming up for a week, and I hated to have him come up and us not have anything to do. So I thought, well, just for the heck of it, let's move south. Let's take out these units, which I thought were in this. Well, they were in this. I'll call it a semi-disturbed area because there was a push berm and stuff there, and there was a little trough that was going through them that had been dug there years later. So I thought, well, just for something to do, let's just move south, and that way Terry will have something to do when he gets here. And lo and behold, we hit the jackpot. Because in that first unit, we recovered almost 1,200 additional animal bones that we would have left there. 64 pieces of FCR, fire-cracked rock, that were from intact deposits that berm that was there sat on top of this stuff. So when I see that berm that was pushed there, the berm had been lifted up and pushed on top of that, so it actually protected it. And so we were able to take that berm off, and then we got into this intact deposits. And and the other thing about this was, most of the stuff was just jumbled up and thrown there, and it was typical of what you're going to find, where you're cooking stuff, you're doing stuff here, and then you're using up fire-cracked rock, and there's all this old bone, you're going, whoop, you're just throwing it off to the side, off into a discard area. It was pretty obvious that that's what this was. We were in there a little bit of a garbage area where we were throwing materials. However, Terry Martin, as he's excavating, one of the things he was doing here, when we get down to, say, a level, he's just taking up the first level, we'll dig it out, but then we trawl it, so we take really good pictures of, make sure there's any surface features or soil discolorations. And Terry, while he was trawling, I was standing behind him, and he goes, "What the heck is this?" In his hand, he's holding this. And I'm looking at it, and I'm going, "Oh my God, I wonder if that's the other half of that ring, glass ring that we found that was like right over there way back in 2012. And so, sure enough, when I brought it home, we cleaned it up and brought it home, and it matched up. It's the other half. That's the one we found in 2012, 2022, and so this is it. This is what it would look like in 1630. And so it's obvious that, so again, it's a piece of jewelry. And it's something that's, it's a very typical piece of native jewelry, where it's either a nose piece or a hoop earring. It could be either one. You could use it as a nose piece or as a hoop earring. Very, very fragile, extremely delicate. It's made from wound glass that undoubtedly came from France. Well, it came from France, and how it made it all the way here without breaking. And then while they were on that site, one of the winters, somebody either had it on them, and it snapped and it dropped, and that's where it stayed until we found it. But what an incredible find to find something like that. Then we finished up on August 22nd. We started taking out the last unit, and I didn't expect to find that either, because this thing had a trough dug through it. I knew over here would be disturbed because this had been disturbed over there. There was the other remains of this mound that was this push-up berm was right there that we had excavated from here. So I didn't expect to find much. However, we did in the jumbled context. And it was not necessarily, it was jumbled context. I'll call it that. because it was disturbed. But we did pull up a bunch of additional animal bone and additional FCR. Again, these are things that had been discarded, years ago by the people that were working in that cooking area and so on. So that's what our end of the excavation at that point. And this is the very last entry. Again, I'm wearing my favorite pants there. Those look good. Those are in style. Actually, style with the rip in them, but they're just my rip pants. But anyway, on the very last day, this is what I wrote. I said, I have offered tobacco and said miigwech and goodbye to my ancestors who once lived here, that are still here in spirit. They still are. And I truly believe that. And I will tell you this, that every day that I pull up to that site, I would holler, woo-hoo! And then every day when I left, I would offer tobacco, and I would take tobacco, and I would put it under that rock right there, and I would leave it for those, and I would say miigwech, and I was talking to somebody. It wasn't like I was just doing it. You could feel it that you're actually talking to somebody, and as a result of that relationship, that whoever lived there gave us those incredible gifts. These are gifts that were given to us. These incredible gifts. So anyway, in 2021-22, we found an additional 1,500 bone fragments, additional flake tools, lots of fire-cracked rock and stuff, and so on. But we found 8 more glass trade beads. We found that glass hoop, the glass hoop fragment, and then the glass curved tube. So it was actually a huge success. But more importantly, we finished mapping. We know that now that I can walk away from the site and feel like we didn't leave nothing back. We did our best to gain all of the knowledge, all of the things that the people that were there wanted to share with us. And I say this and I believe it. And it's like, artifacts are gifts given to us by our ancestors. They are. And it's through these gifts, and it's only through these gifts that they can tell us about who they were. They whisper to us about their lives by these things that they have left behind. And we know from at the Goose Lake Outlet site, again, just to the west down here off the shoreline of Lake Superior, that the stone artifacts in the moose bone, those things tell us, the animal bone, tell us what was there. They'll tell us what was there. And of course, that was an indigenous family's winter hunting campsite. There's no doubt about it, based upon just even those artifacts. But it's the French gift trade artifacts. They tell us when the site was occupied. Okay, because all of these things, these French trade items, can be dated into smaller time periods than the other things that are sort of spread out over time. And we've updated our the dating of the bead assemblage and everything else, and it's incredible how most all of the beads date prior to this. Some of them date back to 1600. They date to here. So this site was being occupied, but it also tells us that it wasn't just one occupation. There was multiple occupations at that site. That's probably why you had a variance in some of the beads are really old, some of them aren't as old. And plus you had 3 moose, you know what I mean? So I mean, if there's 3 moose sitting there, that we know of. I mean, the only reason we know there's moose, I can tell you this, the reason we know there was 3 moose there was because Terry was able to identify the same tooth, the back molar off of an adult moose on 3 different times, 3 of them. So he knows that there was at least 3 adult moose that were processed at that particular site, at least 3. So that's sort of telling you too, they were there for more than 1 year. So they were there for multiple times, hunting and that. But the big question is, who was there? Okay, who was living there? We know what it was, we know when it was, but who was it? Who was living here? This is a site, this is a map drawn up in the 1630s of New France. Look where we are over here, or somewhere over here. They know there's a UP, they know there's a Sioux, that the rapids are there, not because they visited this far here. They know this is here. So they draw that in, but they have no idea what's over here to the west of us. And what we're able to do is that we're able to give some identification as to who was there. Now, one of the things that to determine who was there, that's not all that easy to do. Now, we know who was there, but how do you prove who was there? Okay, we know it was an Anishinaabe people that were there. But in order to say, okay, to prove to scholars, let's just say that, and maybe to ourselves, who was there, to determine who was living there during this Proto-Historic time period, 400 years ago, you got to rely on 3 sources. One, of course, is what we just did, archaeological, cultural, material evidence. That's going to tell you a lot about who was there. You also, and I'm going to jump ahead here, you also can look at early French, the early written and recorded history that they have. And what I found out when I started looking back, they said, well, the French never really wrote a whole lot about what was here. Well, they didn't write a whole lot about what was here, but they wrote a whole lot about what was to the east of us, okay, as they were coming this way, which tells you a lot, about the people that they met there. Now, but it's a very important thing that you really need to take into consideration is our own Ojibwa and Anishinaabe oral history. That's going to tell us, but it's the three of these because you got to put all three together. And of course, this is, you probably all know who Eddie Benton and I was, and he was a civil rights warrior, spiritual leader of Ojibwa, and I had this great, one of the greatest things that ever happened to me in my life because I got to spend 2 days with this guy. That's when we were working on Eagle Rock. And Eddie Benton and I came up from Wisconsin, and he spent the whole day up at Eagle Rock with me and Summer Cohen. And then we went back to the KBIC, and he spent the day there really talking about the creation story, talking about the migration story, and just really putting some detail to it. And I had the honor of sitting there right next to him while he was doing it. And so I got to know this guy pretty good. But he of course, in his book, the Michelle's book, he talks about, of course, a lot of things as far as Ojibwa, but of course he also details the migration story, the migration of the Anishinaabe from the East Coast coming this way. And of course, there's different variations of that oral tradition, of that oral story, right? But they're all basically the same. But there's going to be some differences. But one of the things that Eddie did here was that he really sort of detailed what his beliefs and his thoughts, and he admits too that this is just one version of it because there's other versions. He didn't want to make anybody else angry. But here's what how he thought it happens, and that the people come through here and they come up, they go up to the rapids here, and then they come across the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and of course while they're here. We're talking this spot right here where this particular site is. Now, when that happened is, obviously it was before 1600. We don't know exactly when. Some people say it was around 1400. Some people say it's around 1500. You'll read some people who are totally misled say, well, it happened. Ojibwa people came here at the same time as the Europeans came here. Baloney. It's not true at all. And so these people, so whoever was there, there was no doubt in my mind, based upon all of the evidence, that these people were Anishinaabe people. These were Ojibwa ancestral people, and they would have been the people that would have been living here. There was other peoples that were living in here that they met, and of course over in here, the Siouan and such. But from here all the way across the UP, all the way to the Madeline Islands, along Lake Superior, it was the Anishinaabe Ojibwa clans. And I say clans because we identify ourselves as the Anishinaabe, as Ojibwa, but we're made up of, as we know, we're made up of clan. It's a clan system. And so one of the things I tried to determine, and I said, okay, if that's the case, which is the case, and I'm still working on this, but I'm really getting some good help on this. We're currently doing extensive research to identify the specific band or clan of early 1600 Central Lake Superior ancestral Ojibwa people who spent their cold UP winters hunting moose here at Goose Lake. And I thought that would be really difficult to do. But as I've done my research and I've interviewed people on it and such, and plus did reading on it, it seems apparent to me anyway, and that the people that were living in the central part of the UP along Lake Superior and the Marquette area were what the French referred to as the Nokwe. And of course that would be the Nokwe, the Noki band. There's different ways to say that and to pronounce it, to write it. But it's the ancestral Bear Clan people. It's people of the Bear Clan. And I got good information. I got good evidence that that's the case. Really good evidence that it's just that's the clan that was in that particular spot at that time. Okay, not maybe today, but at that particular time, that's who was there. And so, but what we know for sure, regardless of what clan that these people belong to, because all clans are related. People from one clan are related to the next clan. Everybody's related through family. So we know for sure that it was an ancestral Ojibwa family's winter home that dated back to that time period. And again, it's you think about how many of these must be out there. Must be thousands of them. This is the only one anybody ever found and excavated. Think about it. It's incredible. Now I want to mention this because you may be wondering about what's happened to all of this stuff. Well, this is a great thing about it is first of all, we're not done studying everything yet. We're still working on analyzing the firecracked rock. The bone is still Terry Mark's still doing some more analysis, so we're going to come up with a final report at some point here, but we're still, it takes a long time to do your analysis, so we're still working on things. But everything that we found there is all being professionally curated at the Market Regional History Center. And they have an ultra-modern museum facility. It's one of the top museum facilities, climate-controlled facilities in the state of Michigan. It's the only one in the UP. And so in all of the recovered cultural materials, in all of the site data, all of our notes and everything, they will continue to be respectfully studied and stored at the Market Regional History Center for future generations and to protect those things. And also, when we think of this, and I'll leave you with this, when you try to wonder, you wonder who was there, we think of the people, and I've often thought of this. I thought, what did they look like? Who are they? You know what I mean? Because I'm never at that site with them, but I can't see them, and so I'm thinking. But I know this. This is something that I think of no matter how, whether it be a Paleo-Indian site or a 400-year-old Anishinaabe site, we are who we were. Okay, and so I thought if you want to know who they were and what they looked like, go look in the mirror. You know what I mean? Go look at your family pictures. And what I think of, I said, we are who we were. This is the Paquette family. It's one of our fishing camps up on Silver Lake, summer fishing camps. But the whole crew's there. You got grandmas and grandpas and uncles and cousins, and everybody's there. And they're standing around the fire. And that's who was there. It was us. The last thing, I'm just going to read this to you here because it's a little bit lengthy, and I think it's on that right there, but maybe it isn't. But I want to read this to you. And I always put my name as Jimmy Schmucko Paquette because rather than Dr. Paquette or whatever, I always say, no, I'm Jimmy Schmucko. And that's just to show it, whatever. But anyway, it says, if you will not, listen to this. If you will not share the knowledge of our past, do not search for it is the greatest gift our ancestors could give to us. They will tell us the story of their lives if we put forth the effort to seek out their spirits and if we strain to hear their faint voices. They will indeed whisper to us the stories of their past lives upon our Mother Earth. But only if we open our hearts and listen to them with our souls will we understand the muffled tones of their families' messages from so long ago. But it is also important to understand that these sacred gifts of knowledge must then be shared by those who are honored to now possess them. The greatest reward in my lifelong search for answers from our ancestors is that I now get to share with others the stories that they have told me. Having something so precious to give to others is what fuels the fire in my heart to learn even more, to listen with all of my spirit, for those ancient echoes of laughing children. It is what makes me smile, Jimmy Schmucko Paquette. And that's, you gotta understand, if you understand that, you know what I mean, you'll understand why there's a lot of people like myself that really, from an archaeological standpoint, it's just, we have so many traditions, so many beautiful traditions that we have. But to go back, but this one to actually take us back in time and actually get to, and I will say in a true sense, actually meet the people that were here before us, to meet our ancestors. And so what I say is that, and I'll say it again because it's the last thing I wrote in my notes was that Miigwech, and this is a message, to you. When I left that site, I felt like whoever was there was so happy that we had done the work that we did and we were able to share that. I feel that right now. I can feel that closeness. And so on behalf of the people that were there, for coming here and listening to this tonight, I say Miigwech from our ancestors who once called the Goose Lake Outlet No. 3 site their family's winter home, because that's what it was. And again, they're still there, and they're still with us, and they're still here in spirit. That's all I have to say about that. If anyone has any questions, I'll gladly try to answer as best I can. Yeah, it went an hour and a half. That's what I thought. That was pretty good. I know. I cut out a lot of it. One quick thing about the book that Tyler gave you here, called The Find of 1,000 Lifetimes. This was another Find of 1,000 Lifetimes. But that book there documents a long time ago, if you look at the date on that, when that discovery was made in 1987, was when I was trying to prove that we have been here forever. And when I say forever, I mean since the end of the last ice age. And I went up against many professional archaeologists who told me I was full of baloney. That Paleo-Indians, early peoples, did not live here at UP. And I said, no, they had to have. They would have been here since the end of the last ice age. And they told me I was full of baloney. But I was never going to find any of that evidence because there wasn't any of that evidence. There wasn't any evidence. Well, the thing was, they never went and looked, is what they found out. Because I went out there and I spent thousands of hours just searching, walking, and looking and such. And what I found out was that signs of earliest people, called Paleo-Indians from, say, 12 to 10,000 years ago, that stuff is out there everywhere. This was a main area where people came because of where glaciers were, especially when you get up into Marquette County. When you get up into the highlands up there, into the highlands of Marquette County, the last of the glaciers that came through here formed this beautiful ridge that you see here, but it actually went inland here around 11,500 years ago. But that ice sheet that covered here never encroached upon the middle part of Marquette County and up to those highlands. And so I searched the lakes up in the highlands up in Marquette County, and it was incredible what we found up in there. And we found direct evidence of these people here. This is one of the sites this is the site that changed it forever. Because this is the site where I was able to grab an archaeologist by the nose and pull him out there and say, look at there it is right there. And it's actually true. And so, thank you for giving that gift there. We can thank Tyler for that.
This is his book, The Find of 1,000 Lifetimes. So everybody who came today has one. And then I got extra for the elder group for those who couldn't be here as well. So we can pass those out in the community as well. So thanks again, Jim. Thanks.
Yes.
Thanks
I have a gift for you before you leave. Hand me my thing over there.
And then there's dinner for everybody who's stuck around. So I know that's what. Yeah.
Okay. One last thing, because as Tommy knows, I don't shop. But here we go. I got one last thing to do here.
Oh, and he signed these for you guys too.
Some of these are signed. Maybe I get it if I get it all here.
It's powered 380 going right in.
I'll get it.
You guys can help yourself. We're good.
I want you to see this. Speaking of gifts. Years ago, and I can't remember when it was, back in the early 90s, I went for a walk up on I was up on Lake, Entree Lake, and I was walking up along the outlet that came out of it. I was just walking along the trail, and there was a tree that had blown over, and the roots were exposed. It was right on next to the trail. And I looked into the roots on this trail, and these were there. And this is, of course, is iron axe from early French, very early French trade knife, butcher knife. These two items right here were used by everyone within a family. But these were the two primary weapons of Anishinaabe warriors who fought back then against the British and against others with the French. Even if they had a firearm, like an old flintlock rifle, you got one good shot, and most of the fighting was hand to hand. And so when I read the history of our people, that the primary weapons of choice was these things, was this knife and this tomahawk. Now, why they were left there, we'll never know, and how they ended up there. But I think that in a way, like other things, these were a gift that were given at that point to me personally. And I think maybe because of what I was doing, and I always, like, maybe I'm wrong, but I think that maybe it was a gift in thanks and in gratitude, because I was working essentially as a archaeological warrior, but as a warrior for our people. And but now as an elder, and I respect these things, they have always been in my room next to my bed because of the respect that I have for these things, because I understand what they were. And I'll never know who left them there as a gift. But because I want to, it's time for me as an elder to hand these off to a warrior and someone who I respect and who will carry on the tradition of honoring our ancestors, but also of protecting our children and our grandchildren. And because of that, like, whoever gave these to me, I know I'll gift these to you.
Oh, wow.
Well, again, thank you. I mean, say this is amazing.
You don't have to say
But,
it.
yeah, I mean, look, they found their way back home, right?
They did. They did. It was from here. These were from here.
Yeah.
Whoever left that there, and that why it was left there, we'll never know. But whoever did, it's come full circle now. It's back here again now. It's like for a while it was in Nagani,
You
but
need to write that all down for him.
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah, you gotta listen.
Story to go with it.
Oral tradition. If you didn't hear it right, you didn't hear it. It's-
Yeah, well, we got to record. Well, no, they should count. No, I appreciate. I'll leave these up here so everybody can look at them, take a look, and feel free to, well, maybe talk to Jim if he's okay with that.
Ah, perfect with that.
Yeah. So thanks everybody for coming, and we appreciate it. Have a good one.
Take care.